But at the same time, the trumpets and stuff, so there's
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. We've had a real daguerreotype-filled weekend with Jerry. I feel like from the moment he's landed, we've put him to work. We had a terrific talk from him on Thursday evening. I think many of you were probably here to hear that. And then he's been over at the Kansas City Art Institute for the past 2 days helping students make daguerreotypes, so that's really exciting. And then we have this demonstration here today. And I have to say, for me personally, I've seen this daguerreotype process performed a number of times. And for me, every single time I see it, it's pretty magical. So we're really happy to be able to bring this to you. And I will now introduce Jerry Spagnoli.
Thank you. Okay. We're now in business. Okay. Let's see. So, I hope this won't disappoint people too much, especially Jane. But I'm not going to do like a full demonstration because, as you can imagine, there's many people here who would not be able to get into a dark room. And if I tried to do it here, I'd probably be arrested because the process involves heavy machinery which generates huge amounts of dust which would cling and wouldn't be able to remove it, running water, and a torch. And none of those things are appreciated in the environment of museums as far as I know. So what I do instead is I do a little hybrid sort of presentation. I discuss the history. Actually, I believe what I do is better than a demonstration. So this is the reason I'm doing it. I give a view of the history of the technology, and then there's a couple of videos of me doing certain steps, and then there's a practical demonstration of the hand polish, sensitizing, and then the color that the silver plate changes, which I think are actually the kind of key elements for you to actually see physically. So I think I've kind of streamlined it so you get an optimal presentation. So, but just so you know. Now, so photography was invented or introduced in 1839 in Paris. They were working on it in England as well. There are reports of somebody working on it in South America at the same time. And there is apocryphal tales of somebody in the United States working on it. So in the 1830s, there was a movement to attempt to secure the image that people were seeing through the camera obscura. And I think it's interesting and important to really understand how much, let's say, cultural potential there was in society at the moment that daguerreotype was invented. It wasn't really, Daguerre as an individual or Talbot as an individual having this desire by themselves and working on it and coming up out of nowhere. There was a huge ground laid by the scientific community which established all sorts of parameters which made the culmination of the daguerreotype or Talbot's process or Bayard's process possible. And this cultural base really goes back to at least the Renaissance. But in fact, it goes back further in some sense. The lens and the camera as concepts were available to philosophers and scientists, or as scientists were known, where they were natural philosophers, as far back as ancient Greece. And then through ancient Greece, through the Arab Renaissance or the Arab Enlightenment, and then culturally dispersed through the books that were transmitted during the medieval period. And then in the Renaissance, there was a resolution of some of the issues. For example, pinhole lenses were known in Greece, in ancient Greece, and in Arab countries, I guess in the BCs, in the Hellenistic period as well. But in the Renaissance, cameras were developed as aids to artists. They were used to develop theories about perspective, and the preoccupation of Renaissance artists with depicting the world as a real space is really the antecedent, the direct antecedent to the invention of photography. Before the Renaissance, and of course I'm not in any way qualified to have any of these opinions. Okay, so if there's any professional art historians here, please, I apologize to you right now for everything I'm saying. But before the Renaissance, the depiction of the world was really, we think of it as naive, but the impression I have is that it wasn't so much that artists couldn't depict real space or real people in realistic ways. There was actually a sort of a philosophical predisposition, particularly with iconic art, to depict people in a very formalized, non-spatial way, to suggest their transcendence from the daily. And in the Renaissance, the individual came to the fore. The individual's experience of the world became the locus for everyone's, let's say, valorization. So that in turn, depicting real space was really a symptom of the growing importance of the individual in society and the freedom that the individual felt, and let's say the importance of an individual's ability to engage the world. So it's very abstract. But once you start depicting the world using lenses, using devices, it's only a matter of time before somebody says, you know, it's such a chore to have to learn how to paint or how to draw. Why can't I preserve the image that I'm seeing on a ground glass? Here we have a camera obscura used as an aid to drawing. But camera obscuras were actually used as pleasure devices, as pastimes. There are drawings, paintings, of people simply walking around as if they were holding a single lens reflex camera and looking down at the ground glass, a camera very similar to this, and not trying to draw at all, but simply trying to enjoy the depiction of the world as a flat surface with edges, as a compositional phenomenon. And along with that, there's a sense of light because of the ground glass being backlit, which has its own charm. It enlivens the sense of the landscape that looking at it with your normal vision doesn't have. It's an interesting thing when you go back and you read the early reports in the early journals about the way that the world looked when it was photographed to people who had never seen photographs before. And we have all been inundated since birth by photographs. And in some ways, we see the world as a photograph. I don't know that there's anybody, I guess you could find some Aboriginal tribe somewhere in the depths of the Amazon, who experienced the world with direct vision. But in the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, people experienced the world very differently than we do visually, on their visual field. Our visual field is prescribed by our experience with photographs. We see it on some level, borders around everything. We frame everything just intuitively. So anyway, this is just a kind of preamble to give you a sense of a little bit of the history in my own mind of how vision developed. And then within this context, in the middle of the 19th century, there was a lot of research into chemistry. And a number of chemicals were developed in the 1820s and the 1830s. I shouldn't say developed, but actually refined and understood. And these chemicals, in fact, were the things which made photography possible. Chlorine and iodine, bromine, all of these things were isolated and understood. Then the reaction of those chemicals with silver, people realized that silver could be made light sensitive by being exposed to iodine or chlorine or bromine. Then it was only a matter of how do we stabilize the image. So they could expose a piece of early Wedgwood in the 18-teens, 1820s, successfully made images on white leather soaked in silver nitrate. And he would show them to people under candlelight because they would get progressively darker. There was no way to stop the photoreactive effect. So then the big key to photography wasn't so much making the image, but keeping it stable. and removing its light sensitivity. And that ultimately became the crucial step in the introduction of photography, in particular with Talbot. So that's kind of the groundswell. So there was a huge base, and it actually explains certain aspects too of the phenomena of the invention of photography, that within 6 months of the introduction of Daguerre's process, a whole bunch of separate chemical effects were developed, which improved the process substantially over Daguerre's original formula. And that's because everyone was ready for it. Everyone was already thinking about these chemical issues. So as soon as somebody came along and provided them with a truly stable image, they could then apply themselves to improving it. So improvements happened very quickly. So in a way, it was a group effort. But the daguerreotype itself is, I think, a prodigy, because it is so unique and in many ways completely unprecedented as an image system. And the reason for that is the metal plate that's used as a substrate. So here is, everybody probably familiar with the famous first photograph. This is Niepce's image out his window. This is how it actually looks. If you've seen the representations in the history books, they were actually produced I think it was produced by Kodak in an attempt to kind of transmit what the image looked like, but actually not, they couldn't figure out how to photograph the plate itself and make it look like anything. So basically they were heavily retouched. This is as close as you can get to how the actual plate looks. It's a pewter plate that's been coated with asphaltum, which is photosensitive. Again, interestingly, it's not a silver-based image-making system. So asphaltum, when it's exposed to light, hardens. And where it's not exposed to light, it stays soft. And then when you take that plate after exposure and you wash it with lavender oil, you can loosen the soft parts and wash them off, and then the hard parts stay on the plate. So that's how you get an image using this technique. So it's not really a photograph, and I don't really think Niepce's intention was to make the photograph as we think of it. I think Niepce was trying to produce a printing plate all along. And I think his accomplishment in doing that is really underestimated in the argument between whether he was responsible for the daguerreotype or Daguerre was. I think it's unquestioned that Daguerre was responsible for the daguerreotype. But I think that this argument diminishes Niepce's status as the person who really developed the conception of photo reproduction in a printed medium. So this gets to the point where this is actually a plate. This is around the same period as that original. Niepce made very few images in the camera obscura directly of real scenes. He, for the most part, worked with etchings or engravings that were contact printed onto the plate, as far as I can tell from the letters and things I've seen referring to what he did. This is actually a Daguerre etching, a Clair de Lune, which has been contact printed onto a plate, or perhaps shot through a camera obscura, can't be sure. Again, a metal plate. This was a demonstration plate that was made. I think it's in England somewhere right now. I don't know for sure. But again, this gets to Daguerre's participation. Now, Daguerre was an artist, a painter, and an entrepreneur. He had a show in Paris, the Diorama, and actually these dioramas were also, there was one in London, there were several of them around the world. The Diorama was, a light phenomena spectacular. It was a series of semi-transparent paintings, lighting effects, the use of candles, the use of moving lights, scrims and skylights and frontal lights, all which is intended, and on very large scale. I'm not sure now with the exact dimensions, I should have memorized them, But we're talking about a screen perhaps 30 feet high and 60 feet wide. And the audience would come in and stand on a platform and have their field of vision completely filled with this spectacular painting. And then while they stood there over the course of time, it would change from day to night. They would see a procession of torches move through the landscape. All sorts of phenomena would occur, which created a convincing illusion of reality. So I think Daguerre's preoccupation as an artist, this is Daguerre, and a daguerreotype of Daguerre. Daguerre's preoccupation as an artist was with space and with the effects of light. All of his paintings demonstrate this. Now here, for example, just to kind of return to the diorama briefly, this is probably one of the scenes that he would have used in a diorama. Again, I'm not an expert, so I can't document the exact dates of when any particular image might have been used, but this is the type of thing that he would do. And what he would do is he would show this is the night scene. So he would start with a daytime scene of this architectural situation, and then it would slowly become nighttime. The light behind would get brighter. Then the people who were walking on the ground over there would then be illuminated, and then suddenly torches would appear in their hands, and they would proceed in a procession through this space. And this, of course, was a phenomenon. The diorama was just stunning in its time. It was like a Spielberg movie. It was a big deal. All right. So in this presentation, well, this is one of Daguerre's, this is actually how Daguerre's original daguerreotypes were generally displayed, which is kind of interesting. They were shown, it seems, inevitably in triplets. This particular one features a famous image, which I'll show you in a bit. You can see the scene out his studio. This is shot from the top of the diorama. I'll show you. This is the famous view of a man having his shoe shined. This is the same angle, same lens, same camera, different time of day. And then in the center is a still life. This, I believe, went to King Ludwig of Austria as a demonstration. So, but returning to Daguerre and his ambition and what I was trying to point out about the light and space that he was preoccupied with, and in some ways his responsibility for the invention of the daguerreotype. He had, there's a letter which exists that he wrote to Niepce where he was complaining about Niepce's desire to produce images on paper. And he was making it quite clear, to my mind, although not explicit enough, I think, for, let's say, the casual reader, but to my mind, he was making it quite clear that he was determined to have the images on a mirrored surface, on a polished silver surface, and that it was important to him that the substrate be a reflective substrate. And there's a lot of talk, and there has been for more than a century, about Daguerre accidentally stumbling on the process of the daguerreotype. And I think that that's really not a good representation of his ambition or the realization of, you know, his system of photography. The thing about the daguerreotype and this silver substrate is that it allows for a sense of space in the picture plane which transcends the representation on a flat painted surface or on a flat paper surface. There's a feeling of depth that is the result of the reflective quality that's behind the image and then the image particles which sit on the surface of the plate. For those of you who heard my presentation a couple days ago, you'll remember that I mentioned this. I'll mention it again. Hopefully it won't be too belabored. But the phenomenon is the result of, as you know, a mirror reflects what's in front of it. And it doesn't reflect what's in front of it on the surface of the mirror. It actually, what's reflected in a mirror appears to be behind the surface of the mirror, to the same degree that whatever is reflected is in front of the mirror. So if you show something that's 3 feet in front of a mirror, it will appear to be 3 feet back from the surface of the mirror. It's called a virtual image. And it's the reason that people use mirrors to make rooms look larger. So that's the substrate of a daguerreotype. The actual image on a daguerreotype plate is actually on the surface, and it's palpably on the surface. You focus your eyes on the surface. So with a daguerreotype, when you view an image, you have to reflect something dark in it in order to perceive the light tones and the midtones. So you'll hold it, orient it, so that, let's say it shows your shirt, then you can see the image. But while you're looking at the image on that surface of the plate, you're subliminally seeing the depth. You're seeing your shirt reflected about that far behind the subject on the plate. And that creates the illusion of space, or the holographic effect that people are familiar with daguerreotypes. That's why the subjects have that sense of roundness, of volume. So when you shoot an architectural space, it feels like a real space because of this cue that your eyes pick up, that there's something behind the image that is receding from the image, that the image is suspended in this darkness. Similarly with portraits. When you look at somebody in a daguerreotype, it's not like looking at somebody printed on a piece of paper. When you look at a photograph on a piece of paper, you know it's a piece of paper, and you know that it's recorded a pattern, a graphic pattern that person cast. With a daguerreotype, there's a sense that the person is actually suspended in some sort of medium, in a very 3D, immediate, palpable sense. This is the key to the daguerreotype. This is why the daguerreotype is unique, and really, I think, speaks to the genius of Daguerre. Daguerre, as I say, there's been, for years, unfortunately, one of the problems with Daguerre, and one of the advantages of Talbot, see, Talbot lived in a family estate, and he was able to keep all of his papers and everything. We know everything about Talbot. With Daguerre, within a week of the introduction of the daguerreotype, the Diorama burned down. And in that building were all of his plates, as far as I can tell, except for a few of them that were out, that he'd given to heads of state or that he perhaps sent to somebody as a sample. And all of his notes were burned. So we have absolutely no idea of how he progressed, how he moved from Niepce and his collaboration early on to the realization of the daguerreotype as it was finally released to the public. So, but I think that if you work with the materials and if you come to understand Daguerre's, let's say, his ambition, you realize that he ended up with exactly what he was after. And that couldn't have been an accident. As a matter of fact, another aside thing, with the Diorama, one of his techniques, which I only recently read about, was that he would paint on mirrors in order to create reflective light where he could control the quality of the reflection and the shapes of the reflection. So here he is painting on mirrors, and it can't have passed his notice that a painting on a mirror had a sense of volume to it, again, because of this combination of the virtual image and the image itself. So all of this comes together as well. He'd be working with people who produced mirrors. And when you produce a mirror, you use silver and mercury in order to coat the mirror. So he would have been familiar with the chemical relationships of silver and mercury. The idea that it was all just a big accident is absurd. So anyway, this is my big thing. It's like, I don't know, not too many people spend much time defending Daguerre, but I think it's reasonable. And I think it came out of absolutely nowhere, this particular version of photography. Everybody else was trying to do something which was trying to resemble already existing art. They were trying to do some kind of, like, let's say, a little cheat on drawing. It's like, how many people take up photography and they say, why do you do photographs? Well, I can't draw. And that was really kind of that. Talbot explicitly stated that he wanted to invent photography because he couldn't make good images with a camera lucida. So, but Daguerre, he knew how to draw. He was after something very specific. He was after something which was very individual and it came from his sensibility and his personal desire. And I think that's what's exceptional about Daguerre's accomplishment. So anyway, I'll get on with the technical stuff now. This is the famous view, by the way. This view apparently doesn't exist anymore. Very, very few daguerreotypes by Daguerre still exist. And in fact, as far as I know, every single one of them has been heavily damaged by the attempts of conservation experts to preserve them. So I hope there aren't any conservation experts here. But daguerreotypes are very easy to destroy. And a lot of people apparently dealt with them in a very casual manner. Matter of fact, I heard stories that not too long ago in Paris, daguerreotype was being displayed without any cover glass and just, it's just a piece of ephemera. So, anyway, we have very few of Daguerre's daguerreotypes. This, of course, I guess everyone's familiar with this, but if you're not, this is the famous first daguerreotype of a human being, first photograph of a human being. And you can see it's this fellow down here standing still having his shoe shined. Actually, recently I came across somebody who was complaining, well, you can see the shoe shiner too. How come no one ever talks about him? So it's like the guy getting his shoe shine is the person, but the shoe shiner, well, he was just there, so he doesn't count. This is like the first two people ever photographed, I think, is a reasonable way to describe this image. So, but Daguerre also made these kinds of still lives. He was an artist, and I think he wanted to use daguerreotypes as, let's say, studies for paintings. So this would have kind of been a demonstration of their potential for showing light and shade. This is actually, I was just discussing this earlier, that again, because of our habituation to photography and the media in general, we take it for granted that the world is easy to perceive as a flat plane, and in fact, to depict things with just your eye and a pencil is not that difficult, because we see people do it all the time, although each of us knows we can't draw or paint. We figure it can't be that hard because, you look and there's the world. But in fact, if you go back to the time, it was very difficult for people who did not have very specific and intense training, and even with it, there was distortions. It was very hard to see the world as a flat plane. And there were all kinds of devices like the camera obscura, like another device called the Claude glass, named after Claude Lorraine, who developed it, which was basically, and this, I find this remarkable, that you needed this, but painters would go out with a black glass with a bit of a curve to it, so it was kind of a little wide angle effect. And it would be in a case very similar to a daguerreotype case, and you'd go out and you'd find a landscape that you're interested in painting, and you'd hold the glass up, and the black glass would reflect the landscape and tone down the colors and make it easier to understand visually. And then you would draw your sketch or paint from the reflection in that glass. You couldn't just look at the landscape and paint it. You needed to have something which rendered it more intelligible as a two-dimensional scene. So as I say, we've forgotten how difficult it was to make that translation. So Daguerre's view about the daguerreotype was, again, as an aid, that you could go someplace, make an image, come back to the studio, paint from it. I believe this is a fair statement. Another thing that was the focus of the daguerreotype, and in fact, it was introduced, as you would expect, in a scientific society. And the idea that the daguerreotype could produce accurate images of specimens without the errors inherent in the eye and the hand of an artist were considered to be its fundamental importance. This is an example of how a scientist would demonstrate, the importance of a daguerreotype. Finally, you could get an accurate representation of specimens. These are some views, of course. Views were part and parcel. I've heard that this is by Daguerre. I forget where I picked this up, but it's a view of England, and I haven't heard any stories about Daguerre working in England. So there are plates that this is supposed to be by Daguerre. If it is, it's an extraordinary plate, and exceptional in that it's the only one I've ever seen that's in a state of perfect preservation. And it's in Arts and Métiers. That's the Louvre, and apparently it's a bath house floating in the Seine. But you can see, the clarity and the kind of perfect realization of the view and the landscape. This image would have been a whole plate, 6.5 by 8.5 inches. It was probably a demonstration plate. Daguerre made demonstrations. Giroux, Gouraud made them in the United States, where there'd be a newspaper report about this new prodigy, and then it would give a time. Usually it'd be like two or three, perhaps in a day, weather permitting. Crowds apparently would show up to see this execution, and a plate, ideally like this, would be produced to the astonishment of everybody who was present. One of the things that impressed people, too, about the Daguerreotype in particular, and this again makes it, I think, supersede a lot of the other photographic methods, was that you could take a magnifier to it, and you could actually find details that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Early on, people thought Daguerre was just faking it, that he was actually drawing these things there. But then they said, well, when you look at it with a magnifying glass, there's stuff there that he couldn't have seen, and they didn't have paintbrushes fine enough to paint. So this has to have been mechanically produced. And then again, too, Herschel, who was a friend of Talbot's and who worked with him, and actually Herschel is the man who's responsible for the fixing of paper photographs, saw some of Daguerre's daguerreotypes after Talbot had been complaining that he was the inventor of photography, and that this is a terrible thing, and just because I was lazy and didn't get out in public right away, this other guy, this entrepreneur, kind of just stepped in and took my prestige. And then so Herschel went to see some of these daguerreotypes, and he wrote back to Talbot that that his work was child's play compared to what he'd seen Daguerre's accomplish. So, there was a leap of immense quality between what was available on paper and what was available with Daguerre's method. So, needless to say, very quickly, the public wanted to make them too. Everybody who couldn't draw wanted to make a daguerreotype. So, entrepreneurs stepped in. This is the engraving on the side of Chvallier lens. This is Chvallier's Carminet design, which I think was the winner of an optical award at the very early days of the invention of photography. Everyone, again, like I said, was trying to improve it. Daguerre's original lens would require a very long exposure because it had a very primitive arrangement. It was a simple achromat, which is basically two lenses. And I won't explain the reason there's two lenses, but it's just two lenses basically next to each other, projecting a flat image, but required an f-stop of f16 to have the necessary resolution. So that the effect, and also Daguerre's original process only had iodine sensitization and didn't have the accelerating qualities of bromine, which again was added very quickly. But his own original process would require 10, 15 minutes to make an exposure of a sunlit scene. And portraits were just completely impractical. There was one incident when he tried to, I believe, photograph the King of France, and it was a disaster. So because it was 30-minute exposure or whatever, and who can do that? And nobody can do that. Not even the king can do that. I have to research that, get some more hard facts on it. This is an ad for Giroux, who got the license to produce a kit. As soon as it was announced, the manual was published, which is enticing because it's only a pamphlet, and so therefore looks very simple. And all of the tools necessary became immediately available. This is an illustration of the Giroux camera. And you can see it was a whole plate camera, which is 6.5 by 8.5 inches. And you can see how it resembles a camera obscura very directly. The way it works is, you can see here the lens. As I was saying, it's just these two elements in combination. It's called a simple achromat. And then a sliding box for focus. And then the plate would be inserted here. In this particular case, for viewing, there'd be a ground glass here. And then there's a mirror here so that you could look down into the mirror, see the ground glass, and do your focusing and the like. So that's like the very first photographic camera that was commercially produced. This is what it looked like. This is the kit that you might get. I believe this is the complete Giroux kit. And what we've got is, here's the camera, side view and top view. This is a sensitizing box, very simple, where the iodine, I'm going to show you a little bit of a real kind of sensitizing in a few minutes. This is the mercury pot. The plates were developed with mercury. I guess I should explain the process at this point. And actually, I'll explain Daguerre's version, and then I'll explain the additional components when we get to a slightly later period. So with Daguerre's process, the plate would be placed into a box. You can see there the top view and the side view. And you can see that there's a dish at the bottom of the box that has slanted sides. And in that dish, there'd be iodine crystals. And iodine vaporizes at room temperature. So the box would be filled with vapors. The plate would be polished. Do they have any polishing devices? I don't see any polishing devices. The plate would be polished in his method with a piece of flannel and rotten stone, which is a very fine abrasive. And you'd polish that up to a nice mirror finish, or as close to a mirror finish as you could using that method. The plate would then be placed in the box. Vapors would react to it with it, and you'd propagate crystals of silver iodide on the surface. So silver would react with the iodine, you'd end up with silver iodide, and that's photosensitive. That would then be placed into the camera. Exposure would be made. Then the plate would be placed on this slanted, say, mask, I guess you'd call it, so that the surface of the plate would be facing down and exposed to the vapor of mercury. There was a small viewing glass over here, so you could monitor the development. Development might take 5-10 minutes. Then the plate would be removed, and it would be placed onto this tray. You can see a slanted tray. This is the top view, this is the side view. And then sodium thiosulfate or hyposulfate would be poured across it, and then that would remove the silver salts. It would be washed and dried, and then you'd have your image. Okay. By the way, if anybody has any questions during the presentation, I don't mind answering them, because you might not remember the question after I'm done. So this is a kit. This is pretty much the whole kit. Yeah, there's no sensitizing box in here. There's just a couple of plate boxes. This would be some of the chemistry. This is a plate holder. This is a dark slide for the plate holder. There's a wonderful set. That's the mercury pot up there. There's a wonderful set at the Musée of Arts and Métiers in Paris, which, if you're interested in photography, it's worth going to see. It's a pristine set. So this is a recently discovered and sold early camera. You can see it seems to be less fancy than the originals. It would appear that some franchising occurred from Giroux to other manufacturers. I think the lens is consistent with the Giroux camera, but it would appear that the wood is a cheaper make, and then you can see that even the label is just a simple paper label rather than the kind of beautifully embellished and wax sealed label that you see on the French ones. This was discovered in Switzerland, I believe, and sold for a very considerable amount of money. this gives some sense of, the sort of apparatus that a daguerreotypist might have in his studio. A lot of the people who were really involved with producing quality images would also be constantly experimenting with their own personal ideas and then the ideas that were promoted by the journals of the time. So you would have to have all sorts of alembic retorts, and it's kind of like Breaking Bad, but in the 19th century, So, yeah, I mean, there's just, there it is. I'm not even going to try to sort out all of the gadgets. I got more pictures that are more specific about those things. Now, here's something in the early days, too. As I mentioned, the lens that they were using on Daguerre's camera was really impractical for portraits because at f/16, you really can't do a portrait with daguerreotype. So people started thinking, well, how can you make a camera that might be more efficient than that arrangement? And this is a really interesting innovation. And again, this happened like right away. This is within the first year. Somebody said, well, why do we need to use a lens like that? Why don't we use something which is kind of like a telescope? So I'm going to show you the illustration on the inside, but this is wonderful because it's engraved with Alexander Walcott's name, and he was, I believe it's fair to say, if not the inventor, certainly the promoter of this particular type of camera. He had a very early photo studio in London. And as you can see, there's no lens, kind of like, well, where's the lens? Maybe they lost the lens, but no, that's not how it works. It's actually like a telescope. And the way it worked was the light would come through the aperture and it would hit a mirror in the back, and then the mirror would project an image onto the plate which was actually facing the mirror. And they managed to pick up several stops of speed so that you could get an image now, a portrait, with reasonably soft light in 30 seconds to a minute. And that's a huge advantage. This didn't last very long because, as you see, there were other advances in optics that occurred. This is a modern fabrication of the system. And this is actually the studio. It's kind of a cartoon of the studio. And you can see the way it was done. There's a skylight. The whole roof is a skylight. And the sitter would be put on a platform as close to it as possible. You can see there's a panel above his head to give some sense of modeling. If you have a huge amount of light, the whole thing goes flat. So they put that panel over him to give a sense of modeling and a sense of top light. You can see the camera's up there on a shelf, which would be pointed at the sitter, and the guy timing and exposure. Here a fellow is buffing a plate. So, and then there's people looking at their pictures with magnifying glasses, which is, of course, because they can't believe it's so accurate. This is the kind of image that would be produced by that kind of a camera. They're very small, like 1 3/8 inches, I think. They're very small. Now another camera. This is the first all-metal camera ever produced. Not that there's a lot of all-metal cameras, but this is the first one. And this was produced by Voigtlander. And this camera is very important for, I guess the fundamental reason it's very important is that it has a lens in it which was designed by a fellow named Petsfall. And this was the lens that made all subsequent daguerreotype portrait possible. It was a f/3.5 lens, and it could be made to cover larger plates. With the Walcott camera, as you got into larger plates, the mirrors would have to be so enormous that it was no longer practical. You couldn't make a 3-foot diameter lens, 3-foot diameter mirror in order to produce a half plate. So the Petsfall lens made it possible then to make larger plates. So I'll explain some of the components of this camera first. The lens you see is over here on the right-hand side. That's the focusing knob, which would make it go in and out. The back right now has a viewing back on it, which has a lens, and then there's a ground glass contained inside of that end of the tube. You would set this on a table, and then you would focus on your subject. Then you would lift the camera out of the cradle, take it into the darkroom, take the back off, and then screw in the plate back, which would be this, which would contain the sensitized plate. And you'd come back and you'd place the camera back in the cradle, hoping that it hadn't moved. And then you would make your exposure and go back and process it. So anyway, getting to the Petsfall. Petsfall was an officer in the German military who was in command of a group of other mathematicians. And he had solid knowledge of calculus. And at that time, their calculus, for the most part, was used to calculate the trajectory of cannonballs. This is 1839 into 40. So this, again, this is what's really kind of amazing. All of this happened within the first year of the introduction. And I think it just speaks to the point of photography was at a threshold level. And all it took was the kind of, it's like a supersaturated solution, right? You know, you drop a fleck of dust in there and bang, it's like crystals, you know. So this happened 6 months. They were ready because they knew it needed to be done. And so like I say, this fellow knew how to calculate the arc of cannonballs, and he used that technique to develop the information necessary to design the curvature of the lenses required to produce a very fast lens. And I think it's really kind of funny that, you know, an artillery officer develops a lens, and then the first camera that they make with it looks like a cannon. So, I mean, it just shows the way the world works. I'm sure it wasn't, there's like no deliberate intent, but it's a funny thing how all these things fit together. It's just like they were meant to be. Then this is a diagram. This is kind of interesting because it looks like a medieval diagram. It looks like it's from like the 11th century, some illuminated manuscript. But anyway, so this again gets to that point about the components. Again, you can see the lens up there, lens cap, the viewing back, and then this is the plate holder. So this makes it more clear how it all worked. And this is a plate from that camera. And you can see the fellow he's holding that watch next to him, so he can, just to show you how fast the exposure was, you know. So this is a Petsfall design lens as it became commonplace among daguerreotypists. And you can see the innovation. The previous lens that Daguerre's camera used would have just been this doublet here. And Petsfall combined two doublets with very precise curvatures to produce the optimal result. Fairly flat field, but some spherical aberration, which now wet plate photographers kind of crave. And also very fast apertures with very sharp centers. And generally, f3.5 was with the vicinity. There are some that were as fast as f2, as the design was refined by other makers. But they were always Petsfall fundamentally. The daguerreotype then was brought to America by Giroux, who sold cameras, the Giroux cameras, Giroux equipment. There was kind of like all this argument about him. He seems to have been a very annoying fellow. And people complained about him in the journals, and they were upset that, you know, he's coming there with Daguerre's brilliant invention, and then he was also trying to sell perfume and hair pomades and all kinds of other things. And they just felt it was just undignified that he should just be this kind of salesman. They wanted somebody who was more of a scientist, because this was such an important invention. This is a style. This is an American version of the Giroux camera, or let's say one that ended up in America. This is the full kit. This is the kit that was purchased by a fellow named Bemis, or Bemis. I think it's Bemis. Everyone pronounces it. In a box, and this is the way it would come. This is the kit. He produced a series of whole plates, which are generally considered to be the first photographs made in America. And it seems that, you know, there's some contestation about that. It seems that there was a fellow named Goddard in Philadelphia who also made daguerreotypes in the same period. But as we'll see, you know, as we go on, being the first one to do something in photography was always very important. So I think there's probably always going to be an argument about who made the first photographs. But this is kind of nice. This is actually the receipt for Bemis's kit. I guess, what do you pay, $75, $76 for it? And you can see here it's April 15th, 1840. So it's really nice when some of this ephemera still exists. This is one of his images. This is the King's Chapel burial ground. Yes. So he also made a whole series up at Crawford's Notch of a barn and the surrounding landscape, which you can see in various collections, I believe, and the Nelson Atkins has one. By the way, if I haven't mentioned it, the Nelson Atkins has the world's greatest collection of daguerreotypes, and I'm not just saying that. It really is, and you know, if you're interested in daguerreotypes, you really have to see, first of all, see the show, but it's unbelievable, the stuff that they have, that, you know, it's just very deep collection. Yes?
Can you talk about the color that this plate displays?
Well, the color of daguerreotypes, it's interesting because, you know, you think of them as black and white, but what they're formed by particles and crystals of silver on the surface of the plate. And those crystals will refract light in different wavelengths depending on their orientation, the orientation of the illumination, and in fact their size. So when you develop anything, the process of developing involves the latent image particle, which is quite small, actually imperceptible. And then you develop the image by causing other silver salts around that latent image particle to propagate around it, making it larger and larger and larger until eventually it's visible. So that's like development even in modern black and white photography or even modern color photography. So in this case here, you have a very direct relationship between this propagation of the crystal and the presentation of the plate. So you have a latent image particle, you're propagating as you develop, and if you underdevelop slightly, not slightly, but if you underdevelop substantially, the image particle will be small. And if it's small, it refracts light in a blue wavelength. And I think that that's really why a lot of the early plates were blue. It had been, you know, thought that maybe it had to do with iodine-only sensitizing, which is what we've been discussing with Daguerre's process. But I've made iodine-only plates. Sometimes they're blue, and sometimes they're quite neutral. And I think it has to do with, again, the size of the image particles. There's another kind of blue which comes from overexposure. It's called solarization. And that's another phenomenon which is created by the kind of chaotic buildup of crystals in overexposed plates. But in this particular case here, you're looking at an overall blue early daguerreotype look. And it probably had to do with not enough heat in the mercury bath is probably why it looks blue. So. This is another kit. This is the Godard kit. This is Godard's view of Philadelphia. This is Samuel Morse's camera. Now, Samuel Morse is kind of important in the early history of photography. He was in Paris at the time of the announcement of the daguerreotype, and he was there promoting the telegraph. And it's really interesting to think about, you know, what happened in that historical moment. The telegraph was introduced, the daguerreotype was introduced, the steam engine was introduced, all pretty much at the same time. So it's kind of, you know, an amazing technological period. And when you think about what that really means is, it was the compression of space. It was, the world became suddenly smaller at that moment. You could get images from anywhere in the world in your pocket. You could communicate instantly to somebody else at a huge distance, and you could travel there faster, 10 times faster than anybody ever could before. And it all happened basically in one decade. So Samuel Morse was in Paris. They announced the process. He managed to get an introduction to Daguerre. He managed to, you know, get to see the process worked. He acquired a manual and he came back to America, and he was here before the manual ended up being shipped over. So he was here in America knowing the process in its rudiments before anybody else. So him and Draper, a scientist in New York City, not Samuel Draper, anyway, it doesn't matter. He and Draper promptly decided that they should start a photo studio. So he had this camera fabricated. And it's larger than it looks, I imagine. It's probably about that big. I've never seen the real one. It's in a museum, I think in Philadelphia. This is one of his plates. This is very typical of an early portrait. And I've never seen another matte marked with his name like this. But it's fascinating. Well, this is a thing about daguerreotypes that's really part of the charm now for us, is that many, many millions of daguerreotypes were made. And each one of them was a unique image. So they weren't reproductions. They were reproductions of daguerreotypes, but of these millions, they were mostly original images, and they were unique. And now here's a case where Samuel Morse's name is stamped on a mat. I mean, he must have had many of these mats done. He must have done, I don't know how many portraits. It wasn't a full-blown success, but this is the only one I've ever seen, and I've asked other people. I don't think anybody's ever seen another one. But they're around somewhere, right? Or they've been destroyed. It's like they float through the world in attics and suitcases and trunks, and then they emerge, and like prodigies, like miracles. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm consuming too much. I'm talking too much. Does anybody have any place to go? Sorry, I got to speed it up. Anyway, this is a Draper image. I have doubts about this image myself. This is, as you can see, noted here. It's the first photograph, the first daguerreotype of the human face. So, but I don't believe it, because if you look at that face, she's too comfortable and too spontaneous to have been an 1839 portrait. I really am very, very doubtful. There must have been some misunderstanding about this image. My own, as a daguerreotypist, I feel free to say that. So, this might have been the first photograph. There's always somebody this is a Plum Camera, and so Plum was one of the first to set up a franchise studio. You can see an enormous lens in the front, which is advantageous for portraits. And he set up shop in a number of different cities, Boston and New York and Washington. He was famous for shooting famous people. Now here all of a sudden you can see this is a daguerreotype produced with the full realization of the technical improvements at the time. This would be a mid-40s type of plate. This would involve bromine sensitization to increase the speed and to give a better tone to the plate. It would also involve gilding it with gold chloride, which increased the depth of the blacks and the brightness of the whites. So suddenly, they were capable of this in 43. So suddenly, within 3 years, they had reached this level from their previous work you've been seeing. There were, of course, entrepreneurs who opened shop and distributed the materials and equipment necessary. This is a later style camera, the chamfered box camera. And quickly, I've got to hurry now. There's your Petsfall lens. There's a slot at the top where ground glass would set in. You'd see from the back the image on the ground glass. Remove the ground glass, put a plate holder in, close the doors, make your exposure. Then they decided that for flexibility, they should cut the chamfered box and put a bellows in. So now you have the basic chamfered box, then becomes a bellows camera. Same basic operation. I hope that's not the timer to leave. Here's the arrangement on a tripod. They had tripods. These are the kinds of kits you could get at the time if you wanted to be a daguerreotypist. You'd buy these. Then, of course, the commercial galleries and studios developed. And this is a New York gallery. Gurney was one of the best operators of the time on Broadway. This is what the interior of a gallery might look like. You see quite a posh arrangement. People would, on a Sunday, go for a stroll up Broadway and stop at Gurney's and look at the pictures and perhaps have one made, or just listen to some piano player who was there, and they would just socialize. It was just something to do. It was an entertainment. Here, way in the back, is the daguerreotypist working in a studio. Again, here's the combination of the latest technology, Whipple making daguerreotypes with steam. Whipple was one of the great daguerreotypists of the moment. He was using steam to power his polishing wheels. And a matter of fact, you could pay $0.25 to go down the basement and look at the steam engine. So it was that big a deal. Here's a mechanized polisher. Polishing was mechanized. People have ideas about how laborious it was, but these guys were smart and they worked it out pretty quickly. This is a smaller scale studio, but again, a rather prominent maker. This would have been a Boston maker, Chase. This is Southworth and Hawes' ad, and this has the iconic sun painting the Earth's picture, which was used on Scoville plate boxes, and I think captures the notion of the daguerreotype, that it was nature really producing the image, that it wasn't by the hand of man, it was nature itself that created the image. Is Easterly's studio, very modest affair. There's another in the background there. This is from a stereo card, but it still has a Daguerrean era studio in the background. This is a very early, during the days, this is a Walcott camera, as you can see there. I'll point you out for you. This is a Walcott style camera, so this is probably 1840s. And this was a kind of desperate attempt to get as much light in on the subject and to manage that harsh light for the comfort of the sitter. There would be a mirror, would take the sun, bounce it up into another mirror, and then through here were bottles of blue liquid, usually a copper sulfate, which the plate is only really, for the most part, sensitive to blue. It's not sensitive to red or orange or whatever. So the daguerreotypist decided, well, we don't need all that other light. Maybe if we made it all blue, it would be easier for people to keep their eyes open and be comfortable. So this was an early attempt to use harsh light, but to filter it in some way so that it wouldn't make people squint. This is a nice illustration of the style of the studio at the time. The skylight became very important for the modeling of the features. And of course, the famous headrests, backrests, armrests, they had all sorts of rests. As far as I know, nobody used any of those outlandish inventions. That a simple headrest was what all of the studios used. A lot of the things you hear were just, kind of fanciful. The truth was always simpler than what you get the impression of. This is a nice plate of somebody actually, pretty much doing the job. This is me doing the job with the strobe system. I use strobes to shoot portraits, 30,000 watt seconds with no filtering at all directly onto the subject. If that means anything to anybody as a professional photographer, it's an awful lot of light. You can smell hair burning.
For popularity, producing daguerreotypes was a labor-intensive process,
this is from the
requiring
Getty.
a lot of equipment and skill. The daguerreotype plate is made of copper, faced with silver. To secure it and make it easier to handle, the plate is placed silver side up on an adjustable block. In order to prepare the plate for exposure, it has to be polished. In this modern demonstration of the daguerreotype process, the daguerreotypist applies a small amount of white powder, called rottenstone, to a cloth moistened with dilute alcohol. The daguerreotypist applies the alcohol and rottenstone to the surface of the plate using a consistent motion. The daguerreotypist sprinkles a fine red powder known as rouge onto a long padded stick. The plate is then buffed using the rouge. Polishing the plate in the same direction improves viewing of the highly reflective surface. The plate is then buffed a second time with a clean padded stick in order to increase its reflectivity. It is now ready to be made light sensitive. In the dark, the daguerreotypist places the polished plate face down in a sensitizing box, which contains a small amount of iodine crystals. In about 15 to 45 seconds, fumes from the iodine react with the silver, coating the plate with silver iodide. This process would then be repeated with fumes from bromine, or quickstuff. From the sensitizing box, the daguerreotypist removes the plate, now coated with bromoiodide of silver. The plate is now light sensitive and ready for use in the camera. The daguerreotypist places the light-sensitive plate in a plate holder with the coated side down. It is then secured into place. The viewing glass is lifted out of the camera and replaced with the loaded plate holder. The dark slide is removed to make the plate accessible for the exposure. In the dark, the daguerreotypist develops the plate. A few ounces of liquid mercury are very carefully poured into a flaring iron vessel, heated by an alcohol lamp. The exposed plate is removed from the plate holder and placed face down in the mercury chamber, which is heated to approximately 175 degrees Fahrenheit. After mercury vapor reacts with the sensitized silver, the daguerreotypist removes the developed plate. The daguerreotypist then fixes the plate, making it safe for viewing in normal light by pouring on it a solution of hyposulfite of soda. This removes the excess bromoiodide of silver not acted upon by light in the camera. After it has been thoroughly washed, a gilding stand is used to finish the plate. A weak solution of chloride of gold is gently heated over an alcohol lamp. This hardens the plate and adds to the beauty and permanence of the image.
There you go. So couldn't be simpler. So anyway, so here's a kit. You know, the kind of in the early days, it was part of the income of a daguerreotypist would actually be training more daguerreotypists and selling them kits like this. So it's kind of like gold mining, where they say, you know, the people who really made money gold mining were the people who sold shovels. Yes. Well, you know, oddly enough, it doesn't appear, most people are familiar with the Mad Hatter kind of thing. There are very few reports. There's only one report of a daguerreotypist, and the journals were very attentive to these things. You know, they would report something if it happened. And I think Gurney got chemically poisoned, but Gurney was a chemist, and he was working with much more dangerous chemicals than mercury. He was, you know, because he was experimenting with accelerants. So oddly enough, there wasn't a lot of trouble. The Mad Hatter thing comes from methyl mercury, and they were massaging methyl mercury into hats with their bare hands, and it was easy to absorb methyl mercury. Metallic mercury is much more difficult, really, to absorb. So it appears that there wasn't that much trouble. And a lot of these guys lived to be 90, and then that time there, you know, that's pretty old. So. Anyway, here's some illustrations, again, of what we just saw in the video. So these are methods of polishing. These are some of the various machines that we used. You can see there's a foot treadle and then a spinning disc.
And the importance of the polishing?
The importance of the polishing is twofold. One is to produce the perfect mirror finish, so there's no obscuring defects in it. And then the other is to produce a chemically pure surface so that when you expose it to iodine and bromine, there's nothing to impede the sensitization across the whole plate. So you want an even sensitization across the whole plate. So polishing is really the key to a quality image. So you have to start right there. And the funny thing about it is that when you're making a daguerreotype, if you don't do the polish right, you really don't know it until the very end. So you go through the whole thing thinking everything is fine, and at the very end you find out you've got a disaster. So here's another illustration of another style of machine used for polishing. And yet another one. So you can see the sense of that buff being the only thing available. This is interesting. This is a patent. And it took me a little while to figure out what was going on. But this is like a box that somebody designed. I don't know if anyone ever made it even, but it's a box, and then you'd put the plate on the lid and close the box, and then you would turn this crank underneath here, and basically a random orbit polishing surface would engage the plate. So this is actually the birth of the random orbit sander. So, and that was 1850 probably. So this is how I polish on a wheel. A little bit below the top. And then when you get down to the bottom, make sure you really roll off the bottom edge, like, you know, like that. This is in Montana, one workshop I do in Montana. Because you're not going to get it when you're at the top. Then you turn it over 180 degrees, do top, work your way down, turn it 180 degrees, top, work your way down. Then you go to this wheel, same direction. Don't change direction for this wheel, and don't add any rouge. Start at the top, and done. I've had discussions with daguerreotypists who insist on traditional methods, and then I ask them how long it takes them, and they say, oh, it's about 40 minutes to do a plate. And then I do a polish like this, and they change their minds about how important it is to do it. And that's it. So let's see. And what we got here, what do we have here? Kits. These are sensitizing boxes. There are various sensitizing boxes. This is a European style. You can see the iodine and the bromine would be in this one box. You'd move the plate from one to the other within this box. The slide would contain the vapors so that when the plate is over, you pull the slide and the vapors rise. Then you could push the slide back in to retain the vapors, move it to the next chamber, pull the slide, the vapors rise. So it was a way of, these were basically designed for travel, I think. This is a simple design, the American style. And there's an illustration. I have one here, which people can look at later. This is basically pretty much what you're looking at there, slightly different. This is an exploded view. Glass jar inside of a wooden box. The way it works is there's an aperture, as you can see here, where the plate would go, and then there's a solid piece here so that when the solid piece is in place and the screw is turned, the glass jar and the top of this slide meet and form a seal. And then when you want to sensitize the plate, you push it in like that. So it's a very kind of neat little system. This is the viewing of the plate. I'm going to do a little demo, if there's enough time, of turning the color of a plate. And this is the mercury development stage. As I mentioned before, this is the kind of early version, 45-degree angle of the plate so that there'd be a viewing window to monitor. The later dates, developing boxes didn't feature a viewing window because it was unnecessary. You just knew after 4 minutes or 5 minutes it was done. So this is more of the style that was used in the United States. This is a modern, a contemporary version of it. You can see the top, it's a kind of a film holder design. And the way that works is you would basically pull the top in order to access the slot that you drop the plate into. You close the top, then pull the bottom slide that allows the mercury to rise, develop the plate, then you close it again. And all of this operation takes place in a fume hood. So, and there's very little release from these systems, if any, quite frankly. I've monitored my system and I've put safety test badges inside of the duct of my fume hood on a day that I knew I'd be making 20 whole plates, and then checked later, and there was, in the duct itself, there was no mercury exposure. So I think what it is the temperature that you operate with doesn't drive the mercury out. It produces a kind of a standing fog inside of the pot itself. But it's not enough force to make it come out. I think that's the key to why, in the time, a lot of the daguerreotypists did not get mercury exposure. There wasn't any reason for the fumes to actually go any further than the top of the pot. So, yes?
Is it possible to overdevelop a plate?
Yes, it is. And when you do that, the plate gets flatter and the shadows develop stray particles that are not image particles. So it kind of just basically makes the plate look ugly. But there's quite a lot of leeway. You can be off by several minutes and it doesn't really make a difference. So it's not so severe. Now this is a Becquerel plate. This is the version I teach. In this case here, you don't use any mercury development. So it's completely safe. And you don't use bromine, you just use iodine for sensitizing. And the kind of miracle of this is that you develop it using sunlight through an orange filter. These are some Becquerel plates. They're different looking, but I think they're quite nice. You can get colored effects like this with Becquerel. And this is... What I'm doing is I'm taping the plate face down onto the card opposite the amberlith. And of course, I'm sealing it so that no light will get around the edges. So let's go put this out in the sun. So there you have the amberlith, which what you do is you make your exposure using the actinic rays. And then you use this filter to filter out the actinic rays and to concentrate the continuating rays on the plate. And that makes the development occur. In about 10 minutes, we'll have a good sense of the image. We'll be able to reflect a dark field in it and get a pretty good look at, the general tonalities. We'll be able to tell what areas are going to be solarized, what areas are going to probably be black. Okay. So that's an amberlith that's over it. And that's a kind of it used to be very important graphic arts aid for silhouetting images. You could manually use a razor blade to carve around the thing in a photograph you wanted to separate, and then you could peel away either the inside or the outside. Then contact print, and you could silhouette. But now, of course, there are Photoshop methods to do that, and the material is fading away. There's still Rubylith available, and I'm about to start testing stained glass. And so stained glass should work. It was what they used in the 19th century. And this is the gilding stage, applying a flame to the base after pouring a meniscus of gold chloride to the top. This is a modern gilding stand. And I have a little video of that. It's very easy to scratch. So this is removing the plate from the developing unit and then clearing it in sodium thiosulfate. That's the image with the sensitized layer on it. So then you, classic kind of tilt the tray up, get a dry spot, put the plate down, and then drop the plate. And then just rock it back and forth. I usually say about 40 seconds. That's gold chloride on the surface. Move the flame around like this. Think of it kind of like spray painting or whatever. You want to create a chemical reaction on the plate. I should be counting, I usually go for about 180 seconds. The silver of the plate will take on an obvious sort of amber tone. You'll notice where the plate's dry and where it's wet, how the color of the plate will shift from this kind of white silver to a warmer silver. And then you keep an eye out for any possible staining. Another thing you look for, under ideal lighting situations you can monitor fairly closely, is the plate gets darker and then it begins to get brighter. So I'm going to stop here just for the hell of it. And then you put it in distilled water, and then we'll dry it with a hairdryer. So.
You mentioned Photoshop, which reminds me that there was actually some manipulation of photos. I think there's a photo of some generals at Lincoln where one of the generals wasn't actually there.
Oh, well, of course.
Later actually added.
Absolutely.
How is that? Two different plates?
Well, in that case there, you're dealing with a later period. So that was paper photographs. So I would think that the easiest way to accomplish that and the best, most transparent way would be to simply cut one person out and paste them onto the page and then rephotograph it. And then have maybe somebody go in there and do some light retouching to cover any flaws. So that'd probably be how they do it.
Was there manipulation of the daguerreotype?
Well, they manipulated them for aesthetic purposes. I'm not sure that you did anything kind of nefarious. There are some where they actually scratch people out, so I guess that's manipulation. They just didn't like somebody and they'd be all, or else, they could do things like the perimeter, the border of the image could be affected in different ways. You could create multicolored borders. You could do all kinds of those sorts of manipulations. I'm trying to think, can you think of any? Oh yeah, there's like multiple exposure. There's some kind of like playing cards. They have like the person upright here and then upside down underneath, So I guess that's a manipulation. Actually, there's Southworth and Haas plates, which are extraordinary. They have the image of the person in the center, like maybe a half plate size. And then there's a whole series, like a dozen little images of them in various kind of like round, like turning, so you can see every angle of them, even the back of their head. You know, it's just so, and all on one plate. It's amazing. Oh, what's that? Well, yeah, I don't know that they did any spirit photography in daguerreotype. I don't think I've ever seen any.
Yeah, this is related. Would they have different, unrelated, excuse me, would they have different sensitizing size boxes? I mean, whether they were using full plates?
Well, it depends. I use a whole plate box for everything from whole plate down. So I think that's how they operated for the most part. But they did sell small kits, because if you had a camera that only took a quarter plate and you were traveling, you'd want everything compact. So, yes?
I know myself, I've experimented with overexposure and multi-exposure in the same picture. And you mentioned that Giroux played with light. Have there ever been photos of that experimentation of him doing something similar to that?
You mean as far as for artistic purposes?
Yeah.
No, I don't think they had the conception. I think that when daguerreotypists tried to be artistic, they generally leaned towards emulating genre scenes for the most part. I think that, and I think that they, on a certain level, artistically fail because because of the transparency of the image, you don't have that sentimental edge to it. So it just looks like a couple of guys sitting there playing cards. It doesn't look like a genre scene. So. You know, and in some cases, you know, they would have that idea, and then but they produce something that you didn't even know that they're necessarily going for a genre scene. But as far as abstraction and stuff, that's a 20th century concept. You know, they wouldn't have thought of that. So anyway, this is the kind of final stage after the image is made. And this is useful, I think, to people who may have daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, and wonder about them. You know, can you what's in there, what's the package? Sometimes you have to change the glass, whatever. Things need to be done to them. I don't recommend messing with daguerreotypes in particular. I'm not encouraging anybody to mess with them. But you should know the components of the package. So what you had here, the case, and then you had the plate, and there would be a mat over the plate, and then glass on top of the mat separated from the plate, and then there would be this piece, sometimes not, but mostly, called a preserver, which would wrap around. It's a kind of a foil, metal foil. It would wrap around the whole package. Also, the package of the glass, mat, and plate would be sealed around the edge with tape. And this is to prevent the plate from tarnishing and from getting scratched. Obviously, you can imagine a silver plate would tarnish rather quickly and certainly is vulnerable to scratching. So that's your basic 19th century cased image package. This is just a photograph of the actual materials. So that's the end, because I don't know what the time is. I've been warned that I'm like, almost a half an hour over. If anybody's like, if nobody's in a rush, do I have to clear the room? Is it like, oh, okay. So I got rent on the room, so I'm all right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sensitize a plate so that you guys can see kind of that color that he was talking about and get some sense of the physical aspects of making a daguerreotype. But I can't do some of these things. So yes, and thank you all for coming, who I kept too late. I know everybody got all kinds of wonderful things they can do on a Sunday, and so this is a plate I polished yesterday on a powered wheel, and so it's ready for the hand buff. Now this is the hand buff that I used in the class last couple of days. In the 19th century, this plate would be mounted to a block on the table, and then the buff would be used like this across the top. But because the plates that I use are engraver's copper, they're very rigid, and you can't fold them down like you can 19th century plates. So these really can't be set on a block very conveniently. So, and also, basically, I started doing it this way, and habits die hard. So what I do is I take the plate, again, it's been polished on the wheel, and I drop it onto there. And this is just a block with some double-sided tape. And I press that on. You can never touch the plate with anything. You can't wrap it in paper. You can't do anything. That has to be right off the wheel and then right onto this if you can. But you could keep it and go on to here, but if you keep it, it has to be kept in a slotted box. So the only thing that's touched is the very edges, and that the surface is never touched. So. Oh, that's good. I should explain that. This is velveteen. I use this for workshops because it's easy and disposable. And it's got powdered rouge. I should have brought the powdered rouge to show you that. But it's got powdered rouge impregnated in it. And at home, in my studio, I use leather because it lasts longer, it gets better with time. The thing about this is, after a while it just wears out and you throw it away. But with leather you can use it for years and it just keeps getting softer. So there you are. What I've done now is polished it so that there are lines orienting left to right if viewed as a landscape. This is one of the aspects of daguerreotype. There's always going to be polishing marks no matter how good you are. And the key to getting a good view of the image is that the polishing marks have to agree with how you're going to use the image. If you're going to hold the image in your hand, you want the lines to go left to right. This is a 19th century standard. And if you're going to view it in a gallery situation lit from directly above, you want the lines to go up and down. So in other words, if the lines agree with the angle that the light is coming in at, they vanish completely. So this is one of the things sometimes people are concerned about displaying daguerreotypes, and mostly it's because of that, if they're attentive to details. Because if you light it from above and it has left to right polishing, which all 19th century plates do, then you're going to see those lines very obtrusively. And if you notice down in the exhibition here, a great deal of trouble has been taken to have the lighting come in from the sides, and that's why those plates look so fantastic. So after you've done that, I would blow it off and I would heat it with a hairdryer. But it's all make-believe, right? So it's all right. Put it in here. And we'll stick it in there for a little while. Is my time 20 seconds?
So it's a solid copper plate, and then are you silvering it or are you sending it out?
I send it out. Making daguerreotypes is hard enough. I don't want to have to learn how to plate. It's a mysterious art. So.
Is the way the light affecting the iodine, is that, would you say it's like a corrosion type process?
No, it's a propagation of crystals. So what happens is the silver combines with the iodine, and you get silver iodide crystals. And then they build up in density, and then they refract light depending on how thick. This is the thing about this now. What's happening is the thicker the layer gets, the color changes. So you can tell how much silver iodide you have by looking at the color of the plate. It starts at yellow, it goes to a kind of orange, goes to magenta, goes to blue. It appears to clear, and then it actually cycles through brighter, again, that whole series of colors. So that's how you tell. So yeah, it's not corrosion. It's so I don't know. You can see that it's yellow. See? Okay. So I'm going to put this in here. This is like an early stage. You could use this. There's a general kind of idea that if you use the yellow, that it's going to give you a thinner image and more contrasty. But I had an occasion. I was doing a workshop in Peru, and I was told that they could get a local craft guy to make me a box, and so I wouldn't have to transport it. So it's fine. And he made it out of some kind of exotic wood that inhibited the sensitizing. So I could leave it in there for an hour. It'd still always be yellow. So it was like horrible. I was horrified. But there you are. You've got to do it. So we shot with it, and lo and behold, it was exactly the same as if I had sensitized it all the way to the other colors. So you find out that this is all just kind of maybe, maybe not. So. It's embarrassing. You have no idea. So here you can see now this is kind of like a bluish purple, and that's the kind of the color I would go for with the traditional process or with a Becquerel process. So, and I'm going to leave this up here so everybody can come or because whoever wants to handle it or whatever. This plate has marks on it. I'm going to throw it away, so feel free to do what you want with it. So, and I think that's it. So. Oh wait, I got a question.
But the chemicals in there after some time, do you realize that the chemicals have dissipated enough that you can't use them, or
That could happen.
Kind of dissolve out?
Exactly. Well, what happens is you put crystals of iodine in there, and they slowly kind of evaporate. And crystals evaporating, it takes a long time. But yeah, I mean, you could find that at a certain point, it's uneven. Usually, you'll notice it's uneven at a certain point, and then you kind of open it up and look. And I do that in a fume hood as well, so everything's done in a fume hood. But yeah, it can happen. All right. Oh wait.
In your glass series, your blue highlights,
Mm-hmm.
that was explained to me that that's a result of the exposure.
That's right. Yeah.
So, if looking at the sample in the gallery here, it's a very subtle blue, and I don't know if the slides the other night exaggerated the.
Some of them pretty extreme. Yeah. It depends on sometimes because what's happening is you're overexposing it. So there's a threshold where it's white, and then it's blue. So there are degrees of blueness based on how much more overexposure it has. And actually it has to do somehow with the, and I don't have that much control over it, but it has something to do with the balance of iodine and bromine. In a very narrow margin, you can get a more intense blue or a less intense blue. So, and actually it has to do with the silver, the plate itself. The way that the plate has been electroplated sets up a matrix, and then that matrix will allow for the propagation of the silver crystals in a certain way that'll produce a larger or smaller crystal and produce a different tone of blue. And I have no control over that. So it's very mysterious. So I kind of tend to go with what happens. If you like to control things, this would be a maddening process. So.
Isn't that plate being exposed to light? I mean, does this all need to be done in the dark?
Yeah, you would do this under normal circumstances. Well, you view the plate in light. I use a small night light, but you can use a 100-watt bulb or whatever in order to monitor the color. And then after you've got the color you want, then you turn the light off, leave the safe light on, and put it back into the box from like 6 seconds. And then that'll erase the latent image particles that have been left by the ambient light. And sometimes it's advantageous if you make an image and then you realize you forgot to do something to the plate. You can actually take it back in the darkroom and erase the image and use it promptly without having to clear it and stuff. So, was there any? Oh.
You mentioned being able to use a plate again if you didn't like your results.
That's
so
right.
Is that taking it all the way back down to the silver, or just
No, you got to polish. Yeah, you got to clear the plate with sodium thiosulfate because this is the silver salts are very tenacious. So you have to dissolve those off and then polish again, and so that's why you can only get maybe 3 uses. So.
Regarding the gilding process, is that more for color or to preserve the light?
It's for all kinds of, it affects all sorts of things. First, tonality-wise, it's very similar to selenium toning. It enhances the contrast, it increases the depth of the blacks and the brightness of the whites. It smooths out the image particles, which imparts that kind of mirror-like transparency to the image particles themselves. If you don't do that, the image looks a little bit more like a photograph than like the real thing. And it also makes the particles themselves adhere to the plate more tenaciously. So, for example, if you don't gild it, the lightest touch with a brush will take the image particles off. But if you gild it, that's how they hand colored. If you gild it, it's pretty stable. You can touch it with a brush.
Well, I'm curious because in wet plate, they use a varnish to seal and protect the plate.
Yeah.
And with daguerreotypes, they are basically sealed in the environment and that atmosphere. And I'm always curious why they didn't varnish.
They did early on. There were, in some of them pre-gilding, they did try varnishing. There have been plates found with varnish on them. But it's not optimal. One of the problems with varnishing a daguerreotype is because it's an optical medium, the surface has to be flawless and has to be dead flat. And varnish always has undulations, and that would kill the effect. So I've tried flowing different things on the plates, and it's always been unsatisfactory. Because I've wanted to put naked plates on the wall. I thought about flowing epoxy over them, all kinds of different things, spraying varnish on it. None of them work. They always interfere with the optical transparency of it. So.
Just one more question.
question, and
Oh.
we're gonna have to wrap it up.
I'm going to get in trouble.
I'm sorry.
So after the plate's sensitized, what's the time frame that you have until you expose it?
It depends on how tolerant you are of defects. It's a dry process, so it's not like wet plate. You don't have to shoot instantly. But if you shoot instantly and develop instantly, you're going to have a cleaner plate. I go out, though, on the street and shoot all the time. And so I go out 2 hours, 2 hours, come back. So 4 hours, plate looks pretty good. And if it's a perfectly prepared plate, which you can never tell, really, going out, you'll get a perfect plate coming back. But if you have like little rouge spots, which is likely, they'll get bigger as time goes on. So, but you could keep a plate for days. I had a plate once that I kept for, it was a shot on New Year's Eve, and then it was in a holder, and I forgot about it for a year. And I had heard that you could put it back in the iodine briefly, so I did. I put it back in the iodine briefly, and I used it, and it was reliable, but it had big black spots. So, all right. So, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.